Welcome to Life by Design, episode 409. Hey everybody, welcome to the show. Today we're talking about 3 obvious reasons, causes, spinal problems, and 1 missing link. This is one of the areas that is always exciting for me to talk about, simply because this is, my bread and butter, what we do on a day-to-day basis in the practice. And yet, in discussing with patients on a regular basis over and over again, how does the spine become shifted? How would somebody develop a change in their spine that would create potentially a health problem down the road, or a measurable health problem? But more importantly, these 3 obvious things and this 1 missing link, how do they create spinal problems that can affect our health in ways that we don't necessarily feel? And I think this is a common discussion that needs to be had over and over again, especially when we talk about the spine. I think the normal situation is this. Most people assume that they would know when they have a spinal problem. Most people assume they know when they have any problem. And therein lies maybe the biggest challenge that needs to be addressed on a day in and day out basis in practice and in consulting with patients and people who want to improve and maximize their health. Because if we end up basing our well-being, our health, on our symptoms, or lack of symptoms for that matter, then we're really missing the entire boat. And if you look at pathology, so let's just talk about the health process. On one end of the scale, on one end of the spectrum, you have optimal health. And so defining optimal health is more than just not having a symptom. And to give you an example very, very easily here is, you could feel great and then be diagnosed with a very serious illness. Let's say cancer as an example. Now, cancer is a great example because, other than potentially some blood-based type cancers, when we talk about cancer, we're talking about on for an extensive period of time, sometimes years, sometimes decades or more. And much of that happens in a non-symptomatic state. And so to believe that somebody is healthy, or to believe that you're healthy, even though that's happening in your body, is in many cases stopping people from taking action steps that could slow that, reverse that, or completely transform their health. So number 1 is starting to think differently about health and redefining what health is and having new criteria for what health is. This is really always the basis of the test, don't guess, of the reality exists mottos that we repeat over and over again at Life by Design. To truly know if you're well, you need to have some type of assessment process. You need to be able to measure the body, because the true definition of health is function. And not just function in terms of I can move, functionally, people think about functional fitness, but function in terms of cellular function, meaning the cells of your body actually have to work in their normal optimal states. And because we're made up of to really get down, if you were to give your body what it needs, which was really the formulation of the Life by Design blueprint and why we went down that path and why we developed it, to give your body what it needs is allowing the cells of your body to perform in the most optimal state possible. Now, when they don't get things they need, they adapt and function differently, simply because they're deficient in something, or maybe there's a toxicity as well. It can be both. And I'm not just talking nutritionally. And this is where we'll get into what the obvious problems are and the missing link. And so to give our body what it needs on a cellular basis is allowing the body to grow and be healthy. It's no different than growing a garden. You have to cultivate the garden. You have to give it the things it needs. And if you do, it grows a certain way. And if you don't, it grows a different way. And that different way is usually, if not always, less than optimal. And if that less than optimal happens for extensive times, that can be measurable. And you can measure not just changes in dysfunction from a cellular level, but then you can start to measure pathological changes. And so what most people define as, losing their health, they're generally talking about pathologies. And so if you were to look at a structural radiograph and you see osteoarthritis and changes, those are in many cases years and decades old. That's a pathological change. No different with, cancerous tissue forming or heart disease. These things are pathological changes that happen over many, many years. But there has to be an altered physiology first. There has to be a change in the function first. And I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but I could talk about this all day and repeat this thousands and thousands of times. Because when I still look at how people act and how they carry out their day-to-day activities and their healthy blueprints, it's still in many cases based on how we feel. And if we feel good, we assume that we're healthy. And if we feel bad, and this is the flip side, we assume we're sick. But if you were to consume, say, toxic food and you start feeling bad and then you have vomiting and other processes, yes, you feel bad. And yes, you feel what you've defined as sick, but sick by definition is less than optimal function. And so the cells of your body's not doing something that is sick. It's not a response of dysfunction. It's actually perfectly healthy. And, if anything, if you were to consume toxic food, as per this example, then, vomiting or having other processes to expel toxicity, the faster you do that, the better that's going to be. And even you could claim that that's a measurement of health and a measurement of function. So starting to get out of the mental state that if I feel good, I'm healthy, and if I don't feel good, that I must be sick. And so if we talk about function specifically with the spinal system, so the spinal system and the neurological system really isn't any different than the digestive system or, different than the cardiovascular system. It's just a different system in the body. But we have a different relationship with the spine and nervous system because we've been culturally educated to assume that spinal problems equal pain. But going back to the concept of symptoms, it's not true. You could have lots of changes to your spine that are affecting the nervous system that affect the body in a completely asymptomatic state. Think about your teeth. Go to a dentist and remember that time when you didn't have a toothache, but you had a cavity. It's the exact same concept. You can have changes without symptoms. Those changes are signs of dysfunction. And if you can address those earlier in the process, then much greater chance that you're going to maximize your health. So what are the causes of spinal problems? Well, if we're specifically talking about changes to the spine, the obvious ones are very physically oriented. And so in corrective chiropractic, we talk a lot about physical stress. So physical stress could be an individual trauma, and I think a lot of people think of that. I got in a car accident, I had a trauma. So that's a physical stress that could obviously cause changes to the spine. Doesn't necessarily have to cause pain. Those changes to the spine can be changes on a more minute level. They can be changes on a level that you don't feel and that you don't experience from a symptomatic standpoint, but they can be changes nonetheless that then would continue to accumulate. One that's a little more difficult to wrap our head around is emotional stressors. How does that affect the spine? Well, there is a neurological mechanistic pathway that this happens. Remember, the spine and the bony system that protects the nervous system is also wrapped up in muscles and ligaments and discs, and there are all kinds of components here. And so when you have emotional stress, once again, it doesn't have to be in a state where you think, oh, I'm emotionally stressed or I'm stressed. Simply, if you have emotional stress that your body manage, recognize, you may have an increase in muscle tone. And so when the nervous system becomes amplified or facilitated and the muscles start to act, they start to contract more. And you might even think about the days where you've had a very, a stressful day where you've actually recognized that the tone of the muscles of your body probably seem and feel and the experience is very different. Now, that can happen on a more subtle level. And so what ends up happening is the muscles, they become more tense. They restrict the motion of the spine. When spinal motion gets restricted, it also affects the nervous system, and you get this reciprocal loop that continues. And essentially, you're creating a spinal problem through unadapted emotional stressors. And the third area, which may be even more difficult as we're kind of working down this progression, more difficult to wrap your head around, is chemical stressors. But again, it's really looking at the nervous system. It's not as if, we eat certain food and our spine doesn't move. If you think about the foods we eat, how they interact with our body, the digestive system, the nervous system, they can also be a stressor. And those stressors can also increase and amplify and affect the nervous system. And then the nervous system, because it's connected to the mechanical body, can also affect the spine. And so the obvious ones are this. They are stress, either the individual trauma or repetitive stresses or chronic postural stresses that over time will continue and affect the spinal system. We've got emotional stressors that through neurological processes affect the physical body, restrict the spine, and can create changes to the spine. And then we've got chemical stressors that through a very similar pathway and process can also affect the mechanical systems. And then you've got the missing link. Look across the board at all the different things that people do. The major cause, I think, in my experience over the last 20 years of spinal changes and spinal problems is not what people are doing. And this might be simply, languaging here, but it is important. It's what they're not doing. That's the bigger problem. Oh, and I think that's my problem. That's why I'm so shifted today. Or my bed, I think I need a new mattress. All of those may be very well true. But what you need to do, move your body, strengthen your body. Stop sitting in a chair all day long. Deal with your emotional stressors. Eat better food. And so the bigger reason for changes to the spine, the structure, and then ultimately the nervous system and our body's health is not what we're doing. So spend less time worrying about, well, I need a new pair of shoes. I don't think those are good for me. Or I've got the wrong bed, or sitting in the car. Yes, all very important. But if you were to put more emphasis on what you're not doing, that would have a far bigger effect on the health and function of your spinal system and nervous system and your body's health. And going back to the flower analogy, you would actually meet more of your body's requirements. You would meet your fuel requirements. You would meet your movement requirements. You would strengthen the body. You would mitigate the effects of other stresses that are, really potentially creating structural and neurological changes on your body. So we've got 3 obvious causes, progressively less obvious causes of spinal problems. And then we've got our missing link, which is, guys, we need to do more of what we need to do. We need to focus less on what we're doing that's quote unquote causing the problem and more about, what is it that we are not doing that would have a major impact on our future health. Thank you for joining the drive to 1 million families worldwide living life by design.